Let's start with the Mail piece today on this audit of 330,000 fewer hospital admissions. I mean, we kind of knew it, but it's interesting to see a number being put on it.
Well, we did know, and in fact, I think you remember we talked about it. There were some academics who were attempting to study it because there was an argument made that people were staying away from hospitals and doctors because they were afraid of contracting COVID if they went near them. And I think that that's true. But I think it's also the case that the National Health Service did cease to provide a number of services which it had previously provided, and there is an enormous backlog as a result. And the reason why this is so important to me is because in so many of the arguments that I had over the strangulation of the country, which the government decided on its policy, people would say to me, oh, you just want people to die then. All you care about is money.
Yeah.
And I would say, well, absolutely not. This is not life versus money. This is life versus life. Strangling the economy costs lives, costs people medical treatment, costs people important tests they would otherwise have had, which might have detected cancers, which may now kill them when they wouldn't otherwise have done, just for instance. I don't think anyone can really seriously argue that the health service hasn't been very, very badly hamstrung by its own reaction to COVID, not least by the way in which its staff have been forced to self-isolate in very large numbers, and the way in which the already inadequate number of beds, and this is a result of policies of both Labour and Tory governments, has been made worse by the extra spacing imposed by COVID rules. So the whole thing has been dragging a huge chain of restriction during this entire period. And to separate this from the general government reaction to COVID seems to me to be a mistake. It was part of what they did, and part of the reason why I've always argued we had a perfectly serious and well thought out reaction plan to a major epidemic or pandemic already compiled, and we ignored it and threw it in the bin in favor of the Chinese-style panic and mass quarantining of the healthy. And this still needs to be discussed. Did we take the right step, or did we need to copy the Chinese, or should we have stuck with our original plan? These figures underline to me the very strong case against the policy which we did follow.
Yes, and interesting that we should bring Dominic Cummings into it at this point, because you wrote about him this weekend in your column about how ridiculous it is for him to call you bonkers, which I think it is ridiculous.
I mean, just to say, there are people who can call you bonkers, and people who can't really. If the late Cyril Smith calls you fat, it's not exactly a wounding blow, and similarly, if the lady in Paisley calls you intolerant, it doesn't hurt. And I'm afraid that with Mr Cummings, it's rather hard for him to wound anybody by calling them bonkers.
Yes, he does appear to be. He does appear to be a slight obsessive about what he's doing. But I mean, do you take any note of what he has been saying? Because a lot of what he has been saying, although I find it tedious in the extreme, is that basically the government was all over the place. They didn't really know which way was up from one week to the next. They were making policy kind of pretty much on the hoof, hoping for the best. And they weren't really taking any account, as you've been saying for a very long time, of the collateral damage.
Well, none, but on the other hand, Mr Cummings' view seems to be that if he'd been in charge, then everything would be done more quickly, and we would have shut down the country more thoroughly and earlier, and that way everything would have worked. How this argument still proceeds, I don't know. And the evidence, particularly from the state of Florida in the USA, and also continuing from Sweden, as it happens from Japan as well, is that shutting down your economy is not a particularly effective way of saving lives or reducing the spread of disease. But people still continue to insist, just as they insist that mask wearing is proven effective, to insist that these things work, even in the absence of hard evidence that they do. My feeling is that Mr Cummings has put himself entirely on the side of that faction among government advisors, mainly composed of people who have no responsibilities to the electorate and therefore only have one responsibility, and that's to be as cautious as possible. And that he is, I think, it would be reasonable to assume that if any of the figures, which are themselves not in my view to be trusted, if any of the figures at the end of August are showing increases in positive tests, increases in the number of people who die, who've been tested positive for COVID who later die, increases in the number of people in hospital testing positive for COVID. If these happen, then it will be said that the relaxation that we're currently experiencing, such as it is, was a disastrous mistake. That Mr Johnson has repeatedly made this mistake, and it's time for him to go and be replaced by, let me think now. Who might it be? Some political figure who's been quite closely associated with Dominic Cummings. I'll leave it to your more politically.
Yes. He doesn't mention
who that might be, but I don't be surprised if this happens. If you read Matthew Parris's very interesting column in the Times on Saturday, he reckons that Mr Johnson is in quite serious danger if this relaxation can be portrayed as a mistake, and I think that's true.
Yes, well, interesting. I was talking to John Rentoul earlier on this morning, and he was saying that now that Sajid Javid is in the chair of health, as it were, there's now sort of him and Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson against the man that you speak of. So it's sort of 3-1 rather than 2-2, which it was when Matt Hancock was around. So that's why supposedly we've had more lifting of the restrictions.
I'm not sure about that. I think that in general, ministers are terrified of being shown to have ignored or failed to take the most safe advice, and if it's said to go wrong. But again, I would like to re-examine the figures on which all this is based. We have no idea, because you can't conceivably test regularly the entire population for COVID. We have no idea what the level of COVID positive testing, let's use the word as accurately as possible, would have been during March and April of 2020, during the most severe height of the disease. We don't know, so we have nothing to compare it with. At the moment, all we have is a certain proportion of the number of people who are testing positive. But they're a tiny proportion of the population. And what does it mean if they test positive? Are they ill? And then we have the next statistic, people in hospital with COVID. Well, we discussed this before, if you go to hospital, it's probably the best known way of catching COVID that there is. If you arrive there without it, with a broken leg or a severe illness, you will very rapidly test positive for it. If you then die within 28 days, you will be recorded as a COVID death. Because the next thing, COVID deaths are not deaths of people necessarily from COVID, but deaths of people who tested positive with it. But unless you know what else was wrong with them, the figure it has no real meaning. And we constantly accept on face value these figures turned out by the BBC night after night after night. I said, well, would you please also tell us who's dying with other diseases, who's in hospital with other diseases? And if we're going to have testing stations all over, my hometown is plastered with COVID testing stations. You can't go more than a quarter of a mile.
Is there anybody in them?
There's more testing stations than ice cream vans.
Yeah.
But there are people going in them, yes. And if you seek, you shall find, as we know. So, but what does this actually mean? And how many of these people? Well, I still don't know. What was that footballer in the Scottish national team who tested positive a few weeks ago? I still can't find out if he was ever ill.
Well, he probably wasn't. Pretty good chance he wasn't. I mean, Sajid Javid wasn't very ill, as he said himself. He had very few symptoms.
Isn't it the point? I mean, he had very few. Do lots of other people have any? Until we know these things, until we know what proportion of the number of tests are coming back positive, and then the fact that the huge effort is being made to test people doesn't. There was great. People kept on saying test at the beginning, and I kept asking, well, why? Why is it so important to test? Does testing frighten the virus? And the answer is always no, it doesn't. How does it actually reduce the incidence of the disease? Nobody is thinking about any of this, and so when these figures, such as they are, or if these figures start to rise, as they did at the end of last summer, there is quite possibly going to be a major political crisis on the basis of what?
Well, on the basis, I no doubt they will say, well, of course, all of our previous lockdowns worked, so we'll have to have another one. But, I mean, interesting that you talk about admissions, because I saw a statistic this weekend, in fact, which said that 40% of hospital admissions for COVID are counted. However, they are people who went into hospital for something else and were then tested positive, just as you've said, and who are then put down as a COVID admission. But they're not actually a COVID admission because they've been admitted for something else. So that pushes the number up, first of all, immediately. But also, the other problem I think that we've got at the moment is this kind of headlong misuse of data. I mean, I saw a story in the Sunday Times at the weekend where they were saying, there's been a 5-fold increase in pregnant women coming into hospital with COVID. And you're kind of going, well, that would probably be because a lot of them haven't taken the vaccine, because the original advice was it's not for pregnant women. And certainly the AstraZeneca one is not for pregnant women. But now it seems to have been turned into, now if you're pregnant, you should get the jab.
Well, I know. I wouldn't actually go so much to say I despair at the brain dead nature of this coverage, but I do think people should just be that little tiny bit more questioning. I think the question also needs to be asked over and over again: was the National Health Service at any stage actually overwhelmed? And we hear of one or two individual hospitals which came under very considerable pressure, but what happened was that the NHS worked as it should, and people who would have gone to those hospitals were sent to others, and the burden was carried. We're constantly told that the NHS is under this threat of being overwhelmed, but the only overwhelming that seems to have taken place is that which is recorded in the National Health Service today. This enormous organisation designed to try and keep us from getting iller than we already are has actually been hamstrung in trying to do that for many, many months, and is failing to keep up with its basic tasks. Now, I'm not going to use the word overwhelmed because I don't believe in panicking people, but it does seem to me that the NHS has certainly been damaged by these events. And again, if these are the arguments being put forward to justify the shutdown of the economy, and if in fact the shutdown of the economy and society have done serious damage to the NHS and its ability to treat people, then surely that balances the argument and makes those people who constantly say we must do this because the NHS would otherwise be overwhelmed, makes their point weaker. But again, this is a plea for reason and fact and argument, both of which seem to be driven out.
But if the NHS is overwhelmed because it hasn't got enough staff, because they've all been sent home because of some ridiculous, pinging system, and because they haven't got enough beds because they've had to take some out in order to distance the beds from one another, that's an overwhelming of their own making, surely.
Well, exactly. But this is the kind of examination which here I am, Mr. Bonkers, and I'm saying this, and I can say it to my heart's content, and all that will happen will be that I will be insulted and ignored. What is startling is that the failure of so many people in my trade and in politics to observe or question these things. I'm not saying definitively that I am right, but I am saying definitively that I do not believe these issues have been properly examined. And here we are. How is it that I can say this? I can say this here, and you can listen to it, and other people can. But in general, it will make no impact on politics or on the behaviour of the BBC, which is a propaganda organisation with immense amount of power. And things will continue as they were. And that's why I raised this question of how I came to be called bonkers in the first place when I was an industrial correspondent back in the late 70s and early 80s. And the reason was I stood up against the communists and the fellow travellers among my fellow industrial correspondents, and I didn't do as they wanted me to do, or write as they wanted me to write, or behave as they wanted me to behave. Well, okay, look back at the late 1970s and early 1980s. Look back at the stupid strikes which wrecked so much of British industry, the bad leadership of so many trade unions, many of which have now disappeared or vanished up their own anathemas as a result of the way they behaved then. And also look at the Soviet Union, which so many of those people were sympathetic to, and say who was bonkers and who was right. And sometimes it is going to be the minority voice, the voice that doesn't run with the crowd, which needs to be listened to. Yeah. And I would make that plea here. At least listen to what I'm saying. I do stand against tides. It's a gift I've been given, I think. I do stand against tides, and sometimes it's worth saying, well, maybe just possibly, even if he is a minority and I don't like him, it might be worth listening to this point and seeing how the other side argue against it. But all the other side do in response is it tends to be either ignore me or abuse me or accuse me of wishing in some way to kill other people. Yeah. The low level of the response, again, very like the calling me bonkers back in the 70s. The low level of the response is one of the things which persuades me that I may have hit upon something.
Yes, and those who oppose you in this way also are incredibly sort of scientific and unforensic in the way that they do it, because they don't actually prove you wrong. They just say you're wrong and then move on.
I mean, sometimes I am wrong. I don't make mistakes. I mean, I can't. I made a silly mistake early on in this business about in some argument about smallpox. and which haunts me to this day. A mistake made, regretted, and never repeated. And that's a mistake that I've made, and I've no doubt made others. But I don't claim an expertise. I'm not. No, it's what I try to do is to look at the expertise of others and try to make sense of it. And also, nobody making a lot of people making pronouncements and decisions in this, including many of my opponents in the media and all the politicians involved. They don't have scientific or medical qualifications. But it only matters whether you have scientific or medical qualifications in this argument if you're on the wrong side.
Yes. Nobody questioned.
We're all capable of seeing whether an argument is being honestly and seriously made, or whether it's not being honestly.
Yeah. No, nobody questioned the efficacy of Gareth Southgate, a football manager, when he said at the weekend that all young people should get the vaccine. But stay where you are, Peter. We'll come back to you. I want to talk about floods. I want to talk about a couple of other things as well. Peter Hitchens, Man on Sunday columnist, with us right now. We'll be back with Peter after this on Talk Radio. Peter, I wanted to talk to you a bit about the flooding. I know you wrote about the flooding in Europe before, but we are now the recipients of rather a lot of rain. A lot of parts of London certainly flooded yesterday. We've got apparently 3 more days of it. You've said basically that we should have seen it coming. We have been warned that it would come, and yet nobody's really done anything about it.
This is a particular thing about Germany. Interestingly enough, it didn't affect the Netherlands. And it must say something about the way in which Germany is governed. There's no question, and it's very senior hydrologists in this country, and quite a few Germans in their warning system said they're baffled that although the weather service and the hydrologists warned of approaching floods, so many German authorities don't seem to have evacuated people in time. Germany is not as well run a country as you think. I mean, the joke in Germany now is that if you want German efficiency, go to Switzerland. I've had some remarkably bad experiences with German railways, which used to be superb,
Right.
But in recent years are rapidly approaching the standard of our own. The argument I was really having was that so much of the coverage was not news coverage or analytical, but dogmatic coverage, and people wanted to make the case, as people so often do with exceptional weather events these days, that in fact this was proof that we are undergoing a particular type of global warming. Well, we are undoubtedly undergoing global warming, and I never cease to point out it's unquestionably warmer in this country, for instance, than it was 30 or 40 years ago, and who can argue with it? I think a lot of other global measures suggest the same. That's not in question. But whether that is creating weather events which appear exceptional, because they always do, is another matter. I haven't seen, for instance, anybody producing any work to show that the recent very high temperatures in the Pacific Northwest of America were actually linked to climate change. Nor have I seen any work suggesting the recent flooding in Northern Europe was connected to climate change. People just assume it. And because they do this, and because that becomes the way in which the story is covered, the more important fact in the case of the German floods, which is why on earth weren't people warned in time to get out of danger, doesn't get done. So much political coverage is actually based on a template that people follow. As a very good article many years ago by Peter Oborn, who described how when he went into political reporting, he couldn't get anything in the paper, and eventually he was almost in despair. And he went to one of his colleagues and said, "I don't understand this. I'm busy. I write. I'm constantly sending stories. They never give me." He said, "Well, what are you doing?" And he told them. They said, "Well, you're missing out the cliches. Currently, the big crisis is John Major is in trouble. So every time you write a story, it has to be about John Major being in crisis. As long as you put that in the introductory paragraph, it'll get in."
Right.
And Peter Oborn followed this advice and immediately started getting splashes and page leads in his paper the whole time. And it worked, because everything follows a cliche. And if you don't follow the cliche, then your stuff doesn't get used. And this is the nature of news. News isn't about people saying, "Oh, that's interesting, it's happened, I'll record it." It's about, does this fit a particular agenda which is going on at the moment? And one of the really big agendas at the moment is that there is man-made climate change, and we have to do absolutely everything to stop it, including getting rid of our gas boilers, insulating our houses so we can barely breathe, and destroying our economies. Well, that's what happened, I think, in the German floods. That people were more anxious to pursue the dogma than they were to investigate what was going on. Floods are not uncommon in Germany. The rivers of the European continent are much bigger than ours and more ferocious, and they flood a lot. And you can see on the sides of buildings in historic German towns, the ones the RAF left standing, you can see the marks of floods going back to the 14th century. It's not new. To make out that it's new is ridiculous. Yes. Our own flooding is, there are all kinds of other issues, such as the decision to create wetlands and to refuse to dredge rivers which used to be dredged, and the general failure, for instance, to do basic maintenance of ditches, which I think caused a lot of local flooding, which used not to take place, not to mention the government's obsession with building houses on floodplains. And isn't it a surprise? You build a house on a floodplain and the house is then affected by floods.
Yes. I know, who'd have thought it? You couldn't make it up. Finally, I'll just add my 2 pennies worth in. I had misfortune living in a house in Wiltshire that flooded 3 times while I lived there, all because the farmer who had a field behind the house decided one year to just completely plough it. It had been a sort of fallow field that had long grass in it, and horses used to graze there. But as soon as he ploughed it, the rain literally ran off it like it was concrete, flooded the entire village. And I mean, again, a very simple reason for why it hadn't flooded before was because it wasn't ploughed.
It's so much of the horrible flooding you see in Asian countries and South America is caused by the stupid massacre of trees. Those trees hold the land together, and if you cut them all down, then you get mudslides in the places where they used to stand, and it's a disaster. You would have thought people would learn, but they're so greedy they pay no attention. That's an area of environmental policy where you will struggle to find anyone more militant than I am. I hate people who cut down trees. I think they should, in many cases, be prosecuted for it. There's far too much of it going on. But one of my points is you can be very concerned about the environment without necessarily thinking that George Monbiot has got the answer to the universe.
Yes, that's very unlikely to be the case. Peter, thank you very much indeed.